Hi, I'm Chris Burgwald, Director of Adult Discipleship and Evangelization with the Catholic Diocese of Sioux Falls, and I'd like to welcome you to this session of Foundations of the Faith, which is part of our Bishop Martin Marty Institute for the New Evangelization. I'm here with Father Greg Tschakert, a priest of the Diocese of Sioux Falls and pastor currently in Sioux Falls at St. Catherine Drexel, the parish that we are recording this session in. And today we're going to be talking about the Sacrament of Penance. Father, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me here, Chris.
Yep. Happy to have you. And what we're going to be doing is Father's going to be explaining in his history some of the key points of penance. But for those of you who want further study, you can find in the Catechism a detailed treatment of what the Church teaches about the sacrament of confession or penance. That's in paragraphs 1422 through 1498. So 1422 through 1498. But again, Father, what I'd love for you to be able to speak to is just in your own experience, a priest for many years in our diocese, involved in a number of different things, pastor in many parishes. What are some of the most important things? We'll just start with the first, but what are the most important things? What's the first point that comes to mind when you teach people about the sacrament of reconciliation?
My first reflection is that I've been a penitent for a very long time. I suppose I made my first confession when I was about 7 years old in preparation for First Communion. And I have had a long experience of going to confession myself. Usually probably about once a month for the last 50 years, I suppose.
Really?
And I always remember that when I'm hearing confessions, which I do frequently, that there are two penitents in the room together, that we're both sinners. And that I have committed many of the very same sins that I'm hearing somebody else confess. And I know that if I didn't commit those sins, I could have committed them. I recognize that I'm a pretty weak human vessel, and that somehow or another it's God working through me to bring reconciliation about in somebody that's going to confession. And
I think that's an important point. I mean, for me, there was a time when I was not going to confession, having fallen away from the church for a time, and just talking to a number of Catholic. I think sometimes Catholics, or certainly other Christians who don't have a personal experience of the sacrament, are afraid of it, intimidated by it. And yet what you're saying is that they need to be, because the priest is a sinner just like they are.
I often say that to people. There's two sinners sitting here in the room together, seeking God's mercy and forgiveness. You know, the Catechism of the Catholic Church speaks about the sacrament of penance under 5 titles. And we often call it confession. That's certainly the most generic way that we talk about the sacrament. But it's also called the sacrament of conversion, the sacrament of forgiveness, the sacrament of penance, and the sacrament of reconciliation. And each of those titles for the sacrament really highlights an important dimension of what's going on in that sacrament. You know, I think one of the titles that we just rarely hear is the one that's mentioned in the Catechism, the Sacrament of Conversion. It's a way that God works through the Church to deepen our conversion to Christ. And so, in our ordinary daily life, or maybe our extraordinary life, sometimes we sin. You know, we fail. We get self-centered. We do things that are evil, and at some point we recognize, hey, something's wrong here, and I bring that sinfulness to the sacrament, and I say, I recognize my error, I recognize my sin. Please forgive me, and we experience that forgiveness through the sacrament. And we hope that sacrament deepens our sense of contrition and deepens our sense of, I'm going to try to do better in the future, and maybe I will and maybe I won't, but I'm going to give it a good try, and with God's grace, I'll succeed. So sacrament of conversion, I think, is quite important. You know, people often say to me, well, it seems like I confess the same sins every time I go to confession. Right. It's the same sins. And I say, well, just be glad there's nothing new.
Yes.
Be glad there's nothing new. I think we do have the same weakness. You know, It's the same in our physical life. If I've got asthma, I'm going to have to keep going to the doctor for asthma. And it's probably not going to be for a gallbladder attack. My gallbladder's just fine. It's my lungs that are giving me trouble. And in the spiritual life, we tend to struggle with the same things. My struggles might be quite different from yours.
Right.
And so we keep bringing the same sins to confession, but maybe over the long haul, we really do get better. We get better. We keep working at it. It's an ongoing process. And so I really like that title, Sacrament of Conversion.
I think too, because I think many times when we think of conversion, and we think of maybe converts, people who weren't Catholic become Catholic, or people who were Catholic and come back, but we're all called to that lifelong conversion. And so the sacrament, as you're saying, this sacrament in particular is a powerful way for us to enter into that lifelong conversion.
We're all working on it. St. Augustine says that sin is being caved in on yourself. And that's the root of all sin. No matter what sins we're committing, it's all about me.
Right.
It's being caved into myself. It's doing what I want to do. It's doing without regard for what my family needs or what my neighbor needs or what God asks of me. And so we're gradually trying to get out of ourselves. And when we can identify, yeah, I've been selfish in this way, and this way, and this way, and I'll confess it, and maybe next month I'll be a little better. And maybe the following month I'll be a little better. And over a lifetime, it makes quite a big impression.
And have you seen that in others? Have you seen that maybe? I mean, it's hard for us to speak about this way ourselves, but have you seen that over somebody who's had the practice of confession over many years, over a lifetime, and where they've been able to reflect and look back and say, this has made a difference in my life?
I've often had people express that. I still have this sin, but it's not as deep as it used to be. I'm not as attached to it as I was in the past. And that's a beautiful thing. But part of it is, too, that as we go through life, in the spiritual life, if we do grow closer to God, we recognize our sinfulness at a more profound level.
Right.
We just do, because the light shines brighter, and so maybe we do uncover some new faults that in the past we were unaware of. The most common title for the sacrament is confession. That seems to have sort of stuck.
Right.
And actually, confession is an important element of the sacrament. It's not the only element. But the fact that we actually identify our sins and say them out loud to another person is a very significant part of that journey of conversion. And, we should confess as well as we can. Sometimes we may not be aware of particular faults that we have at some point in the journey. At some point, we might be humiliated by them, and we can say them only in sort of a more generic way. And we don't have to go into all the great detail.
Right.
We don't need to know all the gory details. But the idea of confessing and saying, I've said my sins, they've been heard by the church, and the church has given absolution, that's a very healing process. It really is. And, I compare it to like going to a doctor. You haven't been feeling very well. And so you're going to see the doctor, and he said, well, what are the symptoms? What's going on in your life? What do I need to know before I can make some sort of a diagnosis here? Well, that's what going to confession is. It's saying, well, here's what's going on in my life. Here's some things where I failed. And then the confessor, the priest that's hearing your confession, is able to say, well, here's what seems to be going on in your life. And here's some advice I might be able to give you, and here's your penance that I'd like to give you as sort of the prescription.
Right.
Why don't you try this and see where that leads you? And so, I think historically we looked at the priest confessor more as a judge. Mm-hmm. You go in and you say, here's my sins, and well, now you get the sentence. You get the penance. I think it's much healthier, and I think it's more authentic to the tradition of the church to say the priest is more like the physician. And it's a sacrament of healing more than it is a sacrament of justice.
As you're saying that, I'm reminded of one of the titles that we give to Jesus, the divine physician. And that healing, and that, you know, as we're recording this during the pontificate of Pope Francis, his strong emphasis on mercy. And so this in particular is sometimes called, it's aptly called, I think, the sacrament of mercy, because it's not about judgment first and foremost. That's part of it, but the larger truth is that point that Christ desires to heal me, to save me, to pour his mercy out upon me in the midst of this sacrament in a particular way. So, Father, you referred to, when you talk about, we call it confession. Confession is one part of the sacrament, and then you talked about penance. So what are some of the other components, or any of the other components that you think would be worth talking about, emphasizing?
Well, one of the titles, and perhaps the most traditional one, is called the Sacrament of Penance. And it goes back to the historical origins of the sacrament. In the early days of the church, it was only for very serious sins. In fact, most people probably never went and experienced the sacrament, only those with the most grievous sins. And then it was limited to how many times you could receive it in a lifetime. And the penances given were very severe. You know, it might be, you know, this is my sin, and well, now for your penance, I want you to take a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Or I want you to stand in front of the church and ask people to pray for you, all during the season of Lent. And so it was very serious. It was the penance that was the emphasis. Today our penances are light. They're much lighter. And they ought to be, because we don't win forgiveness of our sins through the penance we do. We get forgiveness through the mercy of God. And yet, I think if we're careful and thoughtful, the penance can be quite meaningful. For example, I will frequently say, especially with children and young people that go to confession, I want you to say 5 Hail Marys when you leave the confessional. But then when you go home, I want you to do something nice for your sister. I want you to do something nice for your mother. And I think for many people that's quite meaningful, because a lot of their sins were related to family life. You know, I fought too much with my siblings, or I disobeyed my parents. I caused trouble in the family in some way. Well, now I want you to go home and do something to kind of counteract that, to kind of go in the other direction. And they can feel kind of good about that. Right. I think maybe many times they go home and they forgot that they went to confession. But sometimes they don't. They go home and do it. Or I will frequently say, well, for your penance, spend a few minutes in the church and think of 15 things you're grateful for, and say a prayer of thanks to God. I think that's a real spiritual exercise then, that kind of helps on that process of conversion, because being a grateful person is certainly part of the journey. During certain seasons of the year, like Lent, I might say, well, maybe you can make a contribution to the rice bowl. Or during Advent, I can say, you know, why don't you bring a package of diapers for the baby shower? Some act of charity that kind of helps us to reach beyond ourselves is sort of an antidote. It's a prescription for that essential self-centeredness that we've been confessing.
So as you said, the forgiveness is given. The penance is the way that we make some effort in ongoing conversion ourselves after Christ has already forgiven and healed us.
That's right. And it's to help us get in another direction. Right. To say, well, there's another way of life here that's going to bring me some happiness, some joy, more than my sins could possibly bring me joy.
Let's come back in the next video and talk about some of the other aspects of confession as well.